All right, welcome to another episode of We Read Theory, a podcast by Mark and Alex, where we read radical leftist literature so you don't have to. Mark, what will we be reading through today?
Today, we're going to be reading a piece called Capitalist Realism by a writer named Mark Fischer. This is, if you exist anywhere in the online leftist space, this is probably a name you've heard before, or might be at least. And in short, what it really gets at is this idea, this really pervasive idea that capitalism is the only real economic system that exists. And in doing so, it kind of takes over history, and we kind of pretend that we were capitalist at times that we weren't. It can get kind of complicated. But really, it's a great piece to help you understand the psyche of people who just don't even understand what it is you're getting at when you talk about the failings of capitalism or possible alternatives.
So this one is to radicalize Facebook wine moms in their local congressman's comment sections, just harassing him.
I mean, I'm pretty sure Facebook wine mom is already a radical ideology.
Yeah, this is a very pro wine mom podcast. Just wanted to make sure everyone understands that.
Moms can have a little wine.
Yeah, true. And also me. All right, so do you want to just get into it?
Yeah, let's get into it. So, capitalist realism as a concept is the pervasive idea that capitalism is the only real economic system that works. Mark Fisher's book serves to describe both the mechanisms by which capitalism is turned from ideology to fact and the repercussions of treating it that way. Central to capitalist realism is a pervasive sense of individualism. As Max Stirner might say, the public as an entity that is more than just a bunch of individuals is a spook. Only the individual is real. I'm also reminded of that very famous Margaret Thatcher quote that there's no such thing as society, there's only men, women, children, and families. The problem with this is that it makes it impossible to solve structural problems because the structures themselves can't take responsibility the way that individuals can. We can only punish the individuals who are a part of the structure whose actions have led them to become stand-ins for the structure's negative aspects. But even that punishment is often undermined by the fact that we all kind of understand that these problems are actually structural. They are problems with capital and not just like individuals. So what ends up happening is that at once we have this notion that there's no structure, only individuals, but that's at the same time followed by the notion that individuals can't really be held accountable either because they're only responding to their incentives and doing their jobs. The actual cause of the problem, capital, doesn't exist in this philosophical framework really, and it remains untouchable as a result. It would be a mistake to pretend that the past was a superbly open-ended time when it came to political possibilities. But for those of us born after the fall of the Berlin Wall, we've never really known any economic system that wasn't dominated by capital. Real existing socialism really doesn't exist in any serious form anymore. And as a result, capitalism has stretched to fill every corner of the political imagination. In particular, capital has commodified resistance against itself. You may be against consumerism, but the only viable way to express this belief is by buying the right things. Mark Fisher uses an example of Bono's Red campaign. It's kind of come to be symbolic of this big problem because Red was all about fighting structural inequality, but the way that you fought structural inequality through Red was by buying products. And once again, there's capital, there's consumerism. Professing anti-capitalist rhetoric while supporting capitalism in action constitutes an ideology coined by Slavoj Žižek as liberal communism. Žižek argues that liberal communism constitutes the dominant ideology of capitalism today. It's further defined by its rhetorical ownership of the new in this context being flexibility, decentralization, and spontaneity. And the effect of this ownership of the new is twofold. The first is that it reinforces the strong individualism that underscores capitalist realism and relegates any mention of structures and popular will to kind of feeling old and outdated. The second is that it makes virtues out of the personal qualities that are necessary to survive in an economic environment that's increasingly precarious for working people. We're talking about, personal flexibility, not demanding a raise every year, being able to handle that precariousness without getting too overwhelmed. These are virtues in the current system. And one of Mark Fisher's main thrusts in this work is that internalizing these virtues has disastrous effects on our mental health, and that the mental health crisis we live in today is much more political rather than medical in nature than we tend to let on.
Okay, so first off, just write what you said at the end. The qualities to survive in this sort of environment are becoming virtues. So just as an example, I'm trying to understand. It's when someone does like,
yeah, I think I understand what you're getting at. Let me use the example that Mark Fisher uses. He compares, so right now the style of economy that we're living in is what Mark Fisher calls post-Fordist, as opposed to the Fordist style of economy, which was kind of pioneered by Ford and his production line quality. The main difference between the Fordist mode of production and the post-Fordist is that, under Fordist production, you work at the same factory, you have a skilled job, and you work there for 40, 50 years, slowly advancing while honing your craft and becoming more experienced, training people below you, and eventually you retire with a pension. In the post-Fordist economy, this is kind of like what we call the gig economy, where you're constantly shifting jobs, you're really, really expendable, no job security, wondering where your next paycheck's going to come from every week. And so the virtues or the behaviors that you have to exhibit in order to survive in these two different economies are really different from each other. And Mark Fisher uses the example of gangster movies to get this across. The Fordist economy is represented better by the crime families of movies like The Godfather, those old mob families where everyone knew each other, everyone knew everything about each other. Loyalty was super important more than anything else. And around the time that we kind of shifted into the post-Fordist era in the late 70s, as Mark Fisher would argue, we also see a shift in kind of how we portray our heist movies, our gangster movies. We have movies like Heat is the example that he uses, which I think we may have watched together a few years back now. But that's the one with
the guy with the long blonde hair.
Yeah, it's got Val Kilmer,
that dude.
It's got Batman. No, was he Batman?
I'm pretty sure he was Batman.
I think he was Batman. Let's not get into it. And those two Italian guys who are in every gangster movie, Al Pacino, Robert De Niro. Yeah. Anyways, so what separates Heat, what kind of defines the gangster market in Heat is that everyone is totally disconnected. Nobody keeps close ties with everyone. Everyone's kind of like a temporary contractor that comes together to do a job. It's like consulting, in that sense. And then they break off and they don't see each other. There's no sense of loyalty is a big weakness. You have to be willing to walk out on things that you care about to go where the money is going. And you have to be able to kind of live in this constant state of unsureness, constant state of precarity. And that's exactly the kind of state that workers are living in today under the gig economy, under the post-Fordist mode of production. And so in order to deal with this, we detach ourselves from reality in a sense. We don't think of time as linear. We kind of live our lives in little vignettes. We don't worry about what's the future going to hold, because you just can't get by that way. You're filled with doom when you realize that there really is no plan for the future. So successful managers are people who can kind of detach themselves from that, messed up aspect of the time in their lives, who can just kind of deal with precarities and almost work in the same way as like the citizens in 1984, where when you hear we've always been allied with East Asia, we've always been at war with Eurasia, it seems hyperbolic, but in a sense that's the way that you reacting to new news as if it's always been true and kind of living in this dreamlike state is a virtue under the current mode of production, and it drives people insane.
So just to have if I can, just to have the super simple example, in a perfect world, everyone's healthcare would be paid for, and that wouldn't be a thing they have to worry about over getting better, right?
That's a great example, yeah.
So, but today we have a kid who starts a lemonade stand so his mom can afford insulin or something like that. And that's viewed incorrectly, you're saying, as hopeful and kind of, I don't know, a sweet thing rather than disgusting because we should be able to provide that.
Yeah, you're getting at it. Maybe even better yet than that example would be a manager who starts up a project, and after 6 months of hard work with his team is told that the project, isn't going to be funded, isn't going to be released anymore. They're working on this thing now, where they're a smaller part, a much larger project. They're doing some lackey work, and then the manager doesn't get upset. He just deals with it, gets his team to do what they need to be doing now, doesn't worry about it, and kind of just accepts it as if it was always true, and is just okay with this constant instability. Mm-hmm. But like you said, workers who maybe lose certain benefits will just get on with it and not worry too hard about it. All of these things are kind of capitalist virtues or post-Fordist capitalist virtues, and kind of extolling those virtues is very damaging to our mental health.
Is like the overall virtue you're getting at just accepting the powers that be?
Yes.
And like there's, I don't know, forces above making these decisions and you just are affected by it. There's nothing going back.
Yeah, it's subservience, but rather than like the Fordist, the virtue is subservience in both the Fordist and post-Fordist model, but whereas the Fordist model is subservience to a king, a dictator, the post-Fordist model is subservience to Loki, some god of chaos. Because that's really what the gig economy, what capital in the gig economy has become. It's become sort of a god of chaos that we all have to live under. This is maybe a little bit off topic. This is really more of an effect of living under capitalist realism. But I'm wondering if there's anything in that intro that we just went over that's maybe more directly about how capitalist realism, manifests in day-to-day life and how it can make it difficult to advocate for social change, socialism, anarchism, communism.
So 2 things came to mind when you were talking about when you had that intro. The first thing that came to mind was that Pepsi commercial with Kendall Jenner, where it's like a bunch of protesters.
Yeah, that's a fantastic example.
And like she just goes up to them, like stares a cop in the face and drinks a Pepsi, just absolutely owning him with capitalism. So sick.
And what's really pernicious about an ad like that?
Can you define pernicious for those of us who are dumb?
It kind of just means harmful in this context. Yeah. What's really harmful about an ad like that is that it kind of scrubs, it turns resistance against authority to an aesthetic rather than to, something that might actually have a philosophical foundation. And we see this in the same way with Mark Fisher uses Live Aid, which was back in the 1980s, 85. And Live Aid has kind of, at least for Mark Fisher, has come to be emblematic of this like kind of aesthetic practice of resisting capitalism, of resisting, Live Aid was against poverty. Who in their right mind is pro-poverty? But that's really important because being against poverty is an aesthetic. It's an affect. It's not actually a policy position that you might pursue. And that's the same kind of thing that you're talking about with that Pepsi commercial, right? Is that, the protesters are just for peace, but there's no policy prescription that you can derive from that. And that's really the sense that a lot of like commodified resistance against capitalism carries with it, is that it's really more of an aesthetic. And so like a lot of people go around watching movies where the big bad guy is the corporation, or listening to music that talks about how like the system is bad. And we can all kind of collectively understand this. And in fact, as Fischer argues, our collective understanding that, maybe not in this vocabulary, but that capital is causing all these structural problems, that money in the way that we do it, the way the stock market works, is kind of silly and a little ridiculous. And by understanding this, it actually allows us to go about dealing with it, because we could never convince ourselves that it was, that it makes sense, that it's rational. So we end up kind of doing it as a form of collective irony, almost. For those of you who are familiar with a YouTube channel named PhilosophyTube, he did a video on Elon Musk, which begins with an extended allegory, so to speak, where Elon Musk is compared to Pontius Pilate. And Elon Musk's participation, and other people like him, and their participation in the capitalist system, they're being the main benefactors of it and pushers of it, and allowing the system to persist, is all really, really harmful in a lot of ways. And they kind of wash their hands of it in the same way that Pontius Pilate did with his killing of Jesus Christ, by symbolically washing their hands, donating to certain charities, by expressing certain politics verbally, but there's no collective expectation that they're actually going to do anything on a systemic level. The symbolic washing of the hands is predominant. And this is really what Mark Fischer is talking about when he talks about liberal communism, this liberal way of acting, way of being, that gets to parade around with socialist rhetoric at times to go, oh, haha, yeah, like, I know how ridiculous this is, but let's be real, like, hating capitalism is just a feeling, like, it's not actually a policy prescription.
Mm-hmm. So you're saying, like, it takes there's people or media that takes all the the hatred and energy you have against, like, the way things are, and then bottles it and sells it to you,
yes,
which is fucking ironic as hell.
Yeah, absolutely.
So, kind of pivoting a little bit, what you said in the intro about people wanting to change things, not being looked at with any real sincerity, like, just, like, say, like, 95% of the population just accepting the way things are and putting down those who actually think, like things could be different and things be better. I kind of feel like that was the more eloquent way of saying, like, the libertarian talking point of, you own an iPhone yet you hate capitalism. You, like, participate in it yet you think it should be improved somewhat.
Yeah. Well, I don't think capitalism should be, well, I mean, I guess I believe capitalism should be improved, but long term we're looking bigger than that. I think you would agree with that.
Oh, of course.
But yeah, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you like that.
Yeah, no, I was just asking if that's what Mark Fisher's saying, if he had, like, a recipe for like for that specific talking point. Like
does he provide a counter argument?
Yeah. Or is it just you should just ignore those people?
I suppose, it's not really, capitalist realism is really more just trying to describe a phenomenon more than provide specific counter arguments. But I mean, the basic fact is that we haven't always lived under capitalism, and that is one of the main features of capitalist realism, that capitalism kind of goes back and subsumes the whole past and makes it impossible to ascribe any, like, progress to things to forces other than capital, even though that's not really how history works. So, if someone argues that like, capitalism brought everything good, I guess you could just say that no, it didn't. It's just not a fact. But Alex, I really want to talk to you about market Stalinism. Is that a phrase that means anything to you?
Absolutely not.
Absolutely not.
It is a load of garbo.
Yeah, it kind of, in the same sense as liberal communist, it sort of sounds like it can't possibly exist, and it's intentionally paradoxical. I don't think Mark Fisher would agree with that, though. In talking about market Stalinism, he's talking about how under the Soviet Union, there was a bad habit of, you would have, like, a project, and you would have certain key performance indexes, so to speak, to measure whether the project was going along nicely. And particularly the White Sea Canal and the kind of production of that canal was a big example of this that Mark Fisher uses. And what ended up happening was that in pursuing indicators of success, the actual production was kind of fell by the wayside. And this is a huge aspect of. Oh, do you have something to say?
Oh my God!
I saw your face light up when I said that. What are you thinking?
No, this sounds like really similar to a book I read about the lie detector, right?
Yeah, that's a really good analogy. Actually, can you explain it a little bit?
Yeah. So from what I remember, this was college. I'm not really actually doing much reading, but so there was this guy who made a lie detector and was so intent on making it work that he just bring the lie detector into the room and hook everyone up to it and sort of get it force a confession out. But it was attributed to the lie detector, even if the confession was just to stop the 8 to 10 hours of interrogation. So it did achieve the result, but just nominally. If the overall goal was to find out who done it, it didn't achieve that, but it achieved the stat of confessions.
Yeah. That's exactly right. And so that's an aspect of what Mark Fisher calls market Stalinism. That kind of anti-productive management style where performance indicators are the product in that sense. That's really the result of, for Mark Fisher, neoliberalism and heavy privatization. And that was done originally kind of with the promise that was going to reduce government bureaucracy. And the big upshot of that is that the bureaucracy didn't go away, because you still have to see what you're doing, make sure it's going on correctly, but it started happening for different reasons in different places. So instead of the government coming into a school, or a government inspector coming into a school and making sure that things are going the right way, we now have imported the bureaucratic functions into the school. And now the teachers are the ones who might have to write up progress indications, who might have to do that bureaucratic work themselves, which is, once again, really bad for people's mental health, because now instead of occasionally having an inspection in, you're under constant inspection. And in a lot of, Mark Fisher gives examples of self-assessment where people are expected to kind of self-criticize. And so in this sense, the mode of production is kind of demanding an affect from you as well as your labor. You have to, it's not just service, it's service with a smile.
And like you said previously, having to meet those ridiculous expectations has got to take a toll on your mental health as well.
Yeah, absolutely. Mental health was a surprisingly really central aspect to this text. We kind of live in an era where mental health is really, really medicalized. Like, if you're depressed, it's because there's a chemical imbalance in your brain. And of course, that's a big part of it. Mark Fisher, that could be the entire thing. But Mark Fisher argues that there are deeper causes to kind of this collective mental illness that we have. Because in a lot of ways, our era feels defined by mental illness. And specifically illnesses like depression, anxiety, ADHD. And these are all very capitalist mental illnesses for Mark Fisher. One of his big prescriptions for the left that comes kind of at the end of this, in the last chapter, is the repoliticization of mental health. That's really, really, that was one of the big takeaways from this text that I understood, because capitalism is very resistant to things that it can't reconcile within capital. Climate change is one of those big things that, the market solves everything. Capitalism can solve everything, but it physically can't solve climate change. In the same way, it can't solve the crisis we're having of mental illness, because it is, in its core, the cause of it.
So we know the problem that the left has with unifying, right? I think there's a big divide between just literally anyone left of center has, between people who want complete upheaval of the system and people who want change within the framework we already have.
Okay.
Now, is change within the framework we already have, in, I guess, Mark Fisher's view, necessarily the worst thing? So I guess would he hate social democrats?
Yeah, I mean, he doesn't... Hate is definitely not the right word. He doesn't say anything...
Disagree with.
Yeah. Well, I mean, obviously he does disagree because he believes that these, the problems that we're facing today are inherent to capitalism, not crony capitalism, not corporatism, but to capital. He's very clear about that. So naturally, the conclusion that you have to draw from that is that a major form of social change is necessary.
Okay, so he thinks radical change is necessary, but how would exactly that come about?
Well, that's the big question, right? Because capitalist realism is all about why it's so hard to even get it in people's heads in the first place. A few prescriptions that he has is to kind of bring back about this idea of society, of a collective identity. Because right now we're super duper atomized, and that atomization is a virtue. So if we can kind of remake this idea of society as a real thing, we can start to make more structural critiques of society. That's a big one. Individualism kind of is the big bad philosophically for when it comes to capitalism. Like, that's the main method by which capitalist realism takes hold, is through this like really, really pervasive individualism. So one example of this is how Mark Fischer talks about social media, how social media is a very atomized form of entertainment. And it's sort of like represents this like shirking of paternal responsibility from higher powers of some kind, and how we ultimately end up in an age where everyone is siphoned off. There's no sense of interconnectedness because we are constantly walling ourselves off from the rest of humanities through like social media subscriptions or through choosing our media in the way that we do. So Mark Fisher seems to be in favor of some degree of a paternalistic something. He says Marxist super nanny, right? And the purpose of this paternalistic power is to encourage people to contend with ideas that they wouldn't choose to on their own. Something that our parents do for us that is considered necessary throughout our development. And so, in short, yeah, that kind of reinstatement of society as an actual entity and of the exertion of some degree of paternalistic encouragement of expanding one's horizons are the two main prescriptions that I personally received from this book.
So after this, you definitely think Bernie Sanders is a centrist.
Well, I mean, I have my personal opinions about Bernie Sanders' personal beliefs, but his platform is obviously not anti-capitalist in any meaningful way. Some of his rhetoric does touch on anti-capitalist rhetoric, but that's really more of an affect. And once again, that anti-capitalist affect is not anti-capitalism, and that was really one of the big thrusts of this book. So yeah, I suppose he is a centrist by that logic. Then
there we go. Perfect. We learned something today. Yeah, so on that note, I guess we can have Mark play us out here. Thank you for all the boys, girls, and people who don't fit into those boxes for listening to this podcast, and we hope you join us next time.
Yeah. How about you tell the nice people where they can follow us on social media?
We literally just talked about that. I'm so fucking stupid. We have a Twitter now. We Read Theory Pod. Wherever you get your Twitter, find us, follow us, and look at the shitty things I retweet.